all three of the kids felt totally safe. As my son said in his eulogy at her funeral, it was such a safe place to be with her. There was, no matter what the world was doing outside, being with her was just full of love. And she loved the world of ideas and adventure.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for The Forum, author, and speaker. In this episode, I ask, who was Ann Dahl? In the fall of 2015, Ann Dahl reached out to me after a column I'd written that had touched her, because she told me of the difficulty of the topic and the sensitivity with which she felt I'd handled it. Would I ever be open to getting together for coffee? I happily agreed, but I'll admit I was a little bit worried that she, an evangelical Christian, might eye my Catholicism with suspicion or judgment. But as we sat down for our warm drink and a treat, I began, somewhat hesitantly, to say grace, starting with the sign of the cross. "I love that Catholics do that," she said, noticing my motions. "Would you mind if I did it too?" And so we said grace together, each crossing our foreheads, and I knew then that I had nothing to worry about. There were no ulterior motives in Ann, just a pure desire to get to know another daughter of the King, and in due time to exchange favorite book titles, prayer requests, and both crosses and joys. Ann became like an older sister with whom I could share challenges in my life as a writer and mother, and how all that might be squared with the Christian journey. Whether in a coffee shop, on her back porch, or tea and crumpets in a tea house, we drew valuable insights from one another, though most often these conversations were more of a gain for me. I was devastated to learn of Ann's passing in January 2023 after a brief but fierce battle with cancer. How could she be gone? We hadn't even arranged our semi-annual gathering yet. I wasn't done knowing Ann, and I know others felt the same. For that reason, I'm especially grateful that her husband Howard was willing to sit down with me and share his thoughts about his beloved and the gift she was to him, their family, and now the gift she can be to all of us. Well, thanks so much, Howard, for joining us today. How are you doing?
Well, you don't know this yet, but it's my 75th birthday today.
Oh, my heavens. Well, congratulations on your 75th, you said?
75th.
Oh, my heavens, you don't look 75.
And I use Ann's birthday card of 2 years ago every year. So I keep a birthday card from her, and it's just so
you have to say what it says. Well, at least the front. You don't have to.
You are so cute.
That's adorable. Well, today we're going to talk about, as you know, we're going to attempt to answer the question, who was Ann Dahl? And I know that the topic is going to be a gift to me personally. So thank you for saying yes to being my guest on this very dear topic. I appreciate it.
My favorite topic.
Yes. Well, before we move into introducing Ann to our listeners, it would be nice to know a little bit about Howard. And when I asked you for a bio to introduce you properly before the podcast, you gave me just a short one. I know it could have been much longer, but you chose to keep it short, mentioning only briefly your many years in business. But I know you were involved in ministry as well. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what your life has been about, and then also we'll go from there. Just share a little bit about your life.
Well, I grew up in Gwinner, North Dakota, and in a family that was a very simple family and became very successful in a very quick order of time with the development of the Bobcat loader. And so I've spent a career in the farm machinery business with the exception of 6 years where I worked with Campus Crusade or Crew, where I met Ann at the University of Georgia. And then we lived in Gainesville, Florida for 3 years, where we led the work for the University of Florida. Did a year graduate study in philosophy at Florida, and then a master's in philosophy of religion at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, where Ann also studied. Then we moved to Fargo in 1977 to start a farm machinery business that only took 12 years for it to be successful.
Okay. So tell me a little, let's go back into your life. Did you have siblings? And what was your faith life like growing up?
I grew up in a Lutheran home where my parents were very faithful, took us to church every week. I sang in the choir, loved music, but it was not a personal thing. You did not discuss faith. And so my own personal faith journey really came alive at the University of North Dakota, where I really, for the first time, understood the nature of a personal relationship with Christ. And Ann's story was pretty similar.
Okay.
For her, it was at the University of Kentucky, though. But parents were very faithful, and but it was not a subject you talked about in the home.
I'm just curious, do you remember a specific incident up at UND that sparked that?
The specific incident for me would have been skiing at Aspen, Colorado, for the second time that winter with a bunch of friends. Hearing them say, "Isn't this what life is all about? It doesn't get any better than this." I heard it over and over, and I said, if this is what life's all about, there's still an emptiness in me. And so that triggered a spiritual journey that was clarified shortly thereafter.
The ski trip ends at some point, and you still have all the life in between the next ski trip, right?
Yeah, and that's where I met with a couple pastors at at a hotel near the Denver airport. And I don't even remember the conversation. All I know is at the end of that time, Christ was deeply real, and I saw the pearl of great price, and I knew that life will never be the same.
And that's an exciting moment, and every person of faith has that conversion experience, and it doesn't always happen when you're 5 years old. Sometimes it happens later, but sometimes it does happen when you're really young.
No question.
Yeah. So, okay, now we know your heart's on fire. And then how does Ann, your lovely wife, how does she cross your path?
Well, she was already at the University of Georgia, had worked there for a year. And she's a couple of years older, and I'm a new staff member. And she'd gone through a real dry period that was, and at her funeral, my son captured the thought about her life, that she says audibly heard God speak to her that I love you. Mm. And she was 25 at the time, and at that, back in 1971, not being married as a woman was, her parents were asking questions. Is there anybody in your life? And she was a little discouraged about a number of things. And but on September 1, 1971, she wrote some beautiful thoughts about God's love. And her last comment was, "Will I ever get married, Lord?" I show up 2 weeks later, and within 3 months, we were just deeply in love with each other. And
And here you have this whole life that unraveled from there. And to think, I have young adult children right now, and 2 married and 3 not. And it's just interesting to see the different things that happen in your life to create that path that's going to be that forever, hopefully, path, right? And how, if that one thing hadn't happened, if you hadn't gone there, if whatever. But thinking about Ann's, it was like a cry of the heart, almost like God made her to be a helpmate to someone, and He heard that cry, and you were the response. So, what was it that attracted you to her? What was it that pulled you and in?
Everything. So I mentioned to you that it was like coming home to a G.K. Chesterton discussion each night. She did 6 years of girls' preparatory school, 7th through 12th grade, where she learned so much great literature and was so thoughtful. And so her mind attracted me. And if you go to the Taylor-Johnson temperamental analysis on being objective or subjective, generally women will be more subjective than objective. She was off the charts on the objective scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so truth mattered to her so much. And she did not like any exaggeration. She really loved truth. And so when we'd discuss a matter, always a question, is this true? And so processing life with her, whether it's business issues, political issues, spiritual issues, it was such a rich conversation. And so I come home tonight, or come home at night now, and I maybe pray more because she's not there. And so I say, Lord, how should I think about this? And whereas generally, Ann, what do you think about this? And so we just had a rich, rich relationship.
What would Ann do, right? Instead of what would Jesus? A little bit of that. So you knew that you were going to be having engaging conversations, and that brought you life.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think you're aware she left me 8,200 pages of journal entries, and I'm probably through 2,500 of them right now.
So are you starting at the beginning, or how are you doing it?
No, I'm doing a variety. I'm taking a year at a time, and so there's surprises. Every week there's some surprises. And
she gave you those and said, here you go, because that's such a personal thing to keep a journal. And I assume it's kind of like the one that I have where I kind of talk to Jesus. Is that kind of how it was, or how does she approach it? It is very much.
It reads like David's Psalms, but she told me to destroy them until November. So just a couple of months before she died, she said, I've changed my mind.
Okay.
I want you to have these journals. But there's a lot of entries. There's some painful about you, some about each of our kids, and I don't want them to see some of these painful things. So be careful when you curate them so that the harmful things are not said.
Right, because a journal is just kind of, you're just putting it all out there and seeing where it lands to sort through things. And we're human and we're trying to figure things out. And yes, sometimes we have to vent about whatever's going on. But then I'm sure you'll see those periods of maturation and growth. And I can't even imagine. So why don't you talk, and then I want to see if you're willing to share some of that or just even what you're learning from it. But tell me a little bit about your early years together and then building a family and how all of that worked out. And then again, kind of your ministry, because I know she was very invested in that part of your life too.
I would say in Ann's 6 years in full-time work with Cru, there are 20 women that she mentored who went into full-time ministry. She had one of the most effective mentoring discipleship ministries I've ever seen. And that continued in a different way throughout her whole life. But she was a great teacher, great listener, and just a huge influence. So many of the girls at the University of Wisconsin, University of Georgia, University of Florida, actually it was 7 years full-time for her. And I have letters from many, many of these women, some that she had kept over the years and many since her illness and death.
She was so very thoughtful, and I'm grateful to have gotten to know that. As you're speaking of her, I can recall that objectivity, that patience, but also always a yearning to be a constant learner and to continue seeking Christ's heart. That was such a beautiful part of her. You saw her in a different way through being a mom and wife. How was Ann a gift to you in that way?
She describes herself as an Enneagram 9, which is a peacemaker. And indeed she was. She always was about reconciliation. First of all, reconciliation with God. In her own journal entries, confession of sin is central. I am just astounded at the degree of daily talking to the Lord about her thought life of the previous day. Lord, I was snobbish with this person. I was condescending. I was short. I wanted to end the conversation instead of giving them fully my attention. And then always, thank you for your forgiveness, Lord. The reason I can have joy is I know that you cleanse my sins, you wash them away. And so that probably was the most startling thing in reading her journals. And I lived with her. And so I know that reconciliation, both with God and with others, was very, very important.
One of the things she and I talked a lot about was race and having grown up in the South and reviewing all of that with a very heavy heart. And I grew up on a reservation, so we had some common points there to talk about our experiences. Did she share that with you at all? And did it come out in her journals at all? Or
yeah, very, very much so. And no one is ever perfectly colorblind, but she's as close to that as you could find. And we had the privilege of working with African American students, both at the University of Georgia and Florida, and we stayed in very, very close touch with a couple individuals. And even after George Floyd, one person we'd worked with who became U.S. Attorney for the state of Georgia, a very, very prominent African-American lawyer. And we did a couple Zoom calls with him. She wanted to hear his thoughts. I did as well after the George Floyd situation. And so we had a couple lengthy Zoom calls with him and with others. So she had a passion for reconciliation at all levels. But, the racial issue was very tender to her heart.
What sort of things did she reveal about that growing up experience and how that prompted some of those questions?
Well, if she were here, she would say she maybe lived in a little bit of a bubble. Her parents were extremely kind, did not have any racial animus, and so she heard none of that in the home of her parents. But she heard it from various friends, and when she would meet a friend either in a high school or at the University of Kentucky where she went, if there was a racial remark, she would pull back from that relationship. She just did not want to be in that context. And so she broke off a few relationships, including a dating relationship at Kentucky when she found out the racist thoughts that a person had that was interested in her.
What do you think it was that caused her to be introspective about that issue?
I can only say the love of Christ in her heart and just seeing all people through the eyes of Christ.
Can you share a little bit about, I asked you about your faith journey. Can you share a little bit about Ann's, especially having known her all these years, having been there at a pivotal time in the beginning and how that grew, and then also just what she shared in her journals?
Whereas I would not have described myself ever as an agnostic, Ann would have. I didn't have a personal faith with any clarification, but Ann went through deep soul searching, I think, her last couple of years of high school, and then during her first year at the University of Kentucky. And T.S. Eliot's Hollow Man just said, I do not want to be that person, that hollow man. And then she read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and the trilemma found in either he's Lord, liar, or lunatic, that had a real persuasive influence on her. And so she gave her heart to Christ at the end of her first year of college at the University of Kentucky.
Okay. That seems to be a pivotal time for so many young people, right? And again, it kind of, what is decided in that time forges the path. So thankfully she did have that epiphany, because it could have turned out differently. Who knows?
Very much so.
Yeah. So what were some of the conversations you had early on about what kind of life you wanted to? I assume, I could be wrong, but because she was so thoughtful and intentional, that there were conversations about what kind of life you were going to build together, and what were the for sure this has to happen kind of things. What were the non-negotiables in what you wanted for a married life?
So we were married in September of 72. So we were married 50 years, 4 months, and 4 days. We were in ministry, and she wanted to remain in ministry full time. In 1974, the summer, we had the privilege of moving to Vienna and traveling in and out of Hungary. Ann loved to travel. I didn't know how much she loved to travel until now I read her journals, and I better understand her passion for that. But for us, it was our first time overseas, and we spent the summer there. My father was doing the first joint venture after détente with an Eastern Bloc country. And so we traveled in and out of Hungary, having dinner with Central Committee members of the Communist Party of Hungary. And that triggered in us, especially in me, a desire to understand why half the world embraced communism. What is the dynamic here? So I went back to the University of Florida after the leave of absence we did for the summer, working with my dad's company, and studied philosophy at the University of Florida, and then wanted to study more. So we moved to Chicago, and I did an MA in philosophy of religion, thinking that either I'd become a professor or we'd go to Europe and work in missions. And so when I felt led to move to Fargo and start a farm machinery business, she was not happy.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like the traveling part satisfied a need within her. I'm assuming this searching that she was doing, and to be able to put herself in those places of other people with other perspectives, and not only in your own right there and where you came from, but also across the world, and I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I'm sure that was part of what she loved about that, right? But you did continue to be able to travel.
Not for a while,
okay.
Not as much. Her beloved England, we spent time in England in 87, and then in the 90s, quite often over the next 30 years really. But the 80s were a tough time for the business. I mean, a really tough time. And as I read her journals, her burden for me as I'm going through bank calling a line of credit, and just the challenge of getting a business started in the 1980s when a third of farmers and a third of implement dealers and manufacturers went bankrupt. It was just a terrible time to start the business. And so I've been reading her journal entries of the 80s and her care for me, her patience with me during this time. And it was hard, financially and every other way. And we're raising 3 young kids at the time.
Right. I wanted to share about that because I'm sure I know you can raise children abroad also, but maybe that was a good thing too, to have a little bit of a grounding when you were raising your children, right? And not traveling so much. I don't know about that, but share a little bit about those years raising children. And I'm curious too about what I kind of have a glimpse of this from we would share about our children, but just kind of what kind of mother she was.
Well, she was very critical of herself. Later on, looking back, she said I was too much of a perfectionist. I expected more for my kids than I should have at times. And but she was, all 3 of the kids felt totally safe. As my son said in his eulogy at her funeral, it was such a safe place to be with her. There was, no matter what the world was doing outside, being with her was just full of love. And she loved the world of ideas and adventure, and so our kids grew up in that way with a pretty broad view of the world, and we hosted loads of international students in our home and at our lake home. And so their exposure to the world through various students also was a very interesting part of their heritage in our home.
Yeah, she seemed to want to be a bridge for her own soul. And also, I could see how that would extend to her children as well.
And during this time, she started work. She had a master's in counseling, undergraduate, and social work. And so she began working at a place called the Perry Center. And then there was an adoption agency called Christian Family Life Service, and the administrator, Andy Dahl, was going to retire. And to keep the agency open, they needed somebody who was a licensed social worker with a master's degree. And they couldn't find somebody. And Ann had never intended to work over 15 hours a week with our kids being young. And they persuaded her that to keep the agency open, they needed her. And so she agreed to work up to 20 hours a week. And that's what she did for the next 23 years, and placed 310 babies into homes. And it was both a amazingly joyous experience, but amazingly troubling, because every adoption, every birth mom had a story that involved a bit of drama. And she was perfect for it, just perfect for that role.
I want to come back to one point you made about her feeling like she didn't live up. I think that's a very common sentiment for mothers. We're connected to our children's hearts, and we're given such a huge responsibility. And at the same time, our children bring out some of the worst in us. I was just talking to another mom who said she felt like it was her worst time, as far as like it brings out, it challenges you to your core. And yet you want to be this loving presence, and yet this is like, it's like kind of tweaking and pruning you, but this other mother that was sharing these sentiments with me said, kind of like you were saying about your son, in the end, like they didn't see it. I think we're harder on ourselves. We put so much pressure on ourselves. So I think that's pretty common, and I hope that in the end she forgave. Again, forgiveness, right? Even to forgive yourself for any of the faults, and to remember all of the beautiful things, right? We sometimes forget about what we gave. So,
she had so much affirmation from so many people, including our children, that, she knew she was deeply, deeply loved.
Well, that seems like a nice stopping point. So we will take a little pause here, and then we'll come back after this break to talk more about Ann Dahl. Who was Ann Dahl? We'll be right back.
When you can't make it to City Hall or the school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. I'm Roxanne Solonen, talking today with Howard Dahl about who was Ann Dahl, his lovely bride who left him such a gift in her words and in her thoughts. And he's still poring over the many pages that she reluctantly a little bit left with him, but there's such a treasure there that he's sifting through and learning more about her heart. And so what do you have here? You have some papers spread out on the table and different things. What do you have?
Well, she did a weekend retreat one time for women, and the title of it was Barriers to Intimacy with God. And it's just so well written and so helpful. One of the barriers is busyness. And she has this thought in there, busyness is the anesthetic, or activity is an anesthetic that dulls the pain of an empty life. Just these comments on various subject that, because for her, intimacy with God was central. A poem she wrote about our youngest son was in Turkey, meeting two Turkish Christians and a German Christian who 2 months after he left were murdered by Islamists who pretended to be friends, pretended to want to hear from them. And she wrote this beautiful poem about these three martyrs, and martyrs that our son would have known. Thoughts on her 25th anniversary, our 40th anniversary, just her reflections on life. A message to our children after she knew that the cancer was serious. Just a beautiful thought. 2015-16, thoughts on death, lengthy thoughts on death. Basically 6 years before she really, faced death seriously. But her deep, deep, unwavering faith that knowing that this life is so short, and how grateful she was for the assurance of salvation, but just teaching on death. And so I sat and listened to Mozart's Requiem and Rachmaninoff's Vespers on a Sunday afternoon for about 5 hours, just reading journals. And I've probably am up to 2,500 pages of the 8,200 pages, and so still discovering things. But some themes became clear to me. And we've already mentioned truth, and the confession of sin was just a daily part of life. And she embraced the gospel so clearly, and she understood her well-being, and what mattered was Christ's speaking to her heart. Generosity may be the biggest thing that she taught me. When we sold our company and had a lot of money for the first time in 1996, she's the one who said, I don't want to change our lifestyle. I just want to give away more. And I don't know if 1 out of 1,000 wives would have said that. She chose to live carefully so that we could bless others. And I'm still learning from her thoughts on that. I've got a couple, 20 different scripture passages about the poor and our stewardship. And so she just wrestled with what the scriptural teaching. Gratitude. So I brought along one of her gratitude journals, 2,990 things that she is grateful for. Hospitality, friendship, and humor, the themes of relationships where you could laugh with each other, encourage each other. And so, I mean, in one of the letters I got after her funeral, that Ann was a magnet, attracting everybody wanted to be with Ann. There are a number of ways that people expressed it. There's a lawyer in Washington that she would go to the National Gallery of Art with every year, wrote 2 pages of the most thoughtful comments about Ann, the depth of her, and why she was so special to be around. Beauty and travel. Beauty was a theme of her life. So when you think of the classical education, truth, goodness, and beauty, those would be central to what she embraced. So, and death, a lot of reflections on death. So I'm trying to curate all these thoughts in a way that can be helpful, especially to my grandkids, but we'll share it with her friends. And So I'm planning, I'm looking at 300 pages, and I'm looking at printing a couple hundred copies, enough to, for all our close friends and family.
Are you willing to share any specific words, like maybe from her gratitude journal or anything where we can get a little sense of her writing or her thoughts? Any little thing?
Sure. This is from the summer of 16. You can take all your riches from faraway lands, take all the treasures you can hold in your hands, and take all the pleasures your riches can buy, but what will you have when it's your time to die? Only one life will soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last, only one chance to do His will. So give to Jesus all your days. It's the only life that pays. That's from a song. This song I had heard while at Trinity. I've not heard it since, but retain the words and melody. Lord, in the years I have remaining, will you keep this before me? Riches, treasures, and pleasures won't go with me to death and eternity. Time flies, and I need not so much to hold on for dear life, but enter into the moments and nail them down with the weight of all my attention. This slows down time. I can live the rest of my one life living for Christ, doing your will, giving you all my remaining days, loving and honoring and glorifying you. I'm writing this like I'll die soon. Maybe it's this birthday. Maybe it's just wisdom. Maybe it's a premonition. I want to live intentionally, do what you want, bring you honor, finish well, go out with a bang, accomplish all the Father has given me to do. I don't want laziness or pain or dullness of spirit to cause me to end life with a whimper, a hollow bed. And on and on and on. This would be very, very typical of what she writes.
I think some people maybe outside of the Christian faith might think it morbid that we would contemplate death, or, was she knowing that her time was drawing close or whatever? But I think it is something that we're called to contemplate because it matters from an eternal perspective, for one thing. And then it also matters for how we're living each day. And she keeps talking about intention, and she was so wanting her days to count, and we don't know. And so I don't know what prompted that, if there were deaths in her life that made her think about that, but it is something that at some point we have to not just think that our lives are, there's so much, I think, of living just kind of for today and to having fun and not thinking about the future. But it's a gift to know that she thought of those things.
It is. And the first comment about death is from 1987, and it's just a reflection on song. She was always interacting with passages of Scripture. And so Psalm 23, even though I walk through the shadow of death. And then she writes, death, exclamation point. I have not even thought about it. How do I want to be when I die? And the one word she said was, I want to be brave. I had not read that passage. The last month of her life, I told her almost every day, you are so brave, Ann. I used the very word brave. So an answer to prayer from 1987, yes. When I die, I want to be brave. And that's the word that came to mind.
How beautiful. You reached right into her heart with something she was yearning to know and to live. Yeah.
One other thing she found in 2016 a 25-year-old list of 9 things she wanted to have happen in her life, and all 9 were realized.
Wow.
And so she was just overwhelmed. She found this list, goals for my family and life, and the first one, obviously, to have kids who love God. Mm-hmm, and that was accomplished. have a close relationship with my husband, which you don't take for granted. And she writes flowery things about me.
Other than you are so cute.
To have kids who marry well, to live overseas. And she says, whoops, didn't live overseas, but have traveled overseas so much. I mean, she went with me to Russia 13 or 14 times. She visited England a number of times, twice to Australia, China. And so she just loved travel and learning about other places. All 9 things on her list were just fulfilled. And so she was so thrilled 25 years after saying, these are my goals. This is what I aspire to in life. And to realize that, yes, this has happened.
Well, there was an event that I was invited to to the Chesterton Society, and I ended up getting ill at that point. So I was really looking forward to seeing her and all of you, and I never got that chance, and I didn't even know that she was ill. So it shocked me to hear of her death. She was such a lively presence, and it was time for us to get together and have our biannual gathering when I found out she passed. I don't want to prod too much, but I am curious how those last months went as far as the conversations she was able to have and anything that you were able to. It's just such a precious time. I know from being with my dad in his final days, when you become aware that that time really truly is limited, what do you do at that time, right? And so I don't know what she was able to express in those days. If there's anything that you could share that she would want people to know about.
She was so hopeful against all odds that life would be prolonged. She wanted to live. She saw all these precious grandchildren and her kids and in-laws and me, and she wanted to live, but she became well aware that very unlikely that there was a cure for her leiomyosarcoma. We had privilege of the gift of friends to fly to California for a couple experimental treatments. And she was so brave doing that because it was so hard for her. So she was able to have her sister and brother come up just 2 weeks before she died and have just amazing times reminiscing about their life growing up. And it couldn't have been more tender, more sweet. And just to see them talk about their own childhood growing up. And she was just showered with, I can't even remember how many, people called or sent cards or number of people praying, but she just felt so deeply loved, and she was well aware of the extent of care for her. But it was really hard for her to say goodbye. And hard for
everyone, yeah. I'm sure you've grappled a little bit with God on that issue, and that's a human thing to do. And maybe you're still doing that. Have you come to any conclusions as to what God was up to, in taking Ann well before you were ready to do that? Just, there might be other people out there that are having a time with their loved one that's near the end. What would you offer them in your experience with Ann?
What Ann shared with my daughter, who was having a especially difficult time, because Ann was not just her best friend, but really a mentor in so many ways to her kids as well. But for all 3 of my kids, it was difficult. But Ann taught us, and she remembered a dear friend from Atlanta whose wife died a painful death of cancer at the age of 35. And we had the privilege of being with them during her illness before she died. And she asked our friend, how are you handling your relationship with God over your wife's painful battle with cancer? And he quoted Peter from John 7 or 8, somewhere in there. Are you going to go too, Peter? And Peter says, to whom shall I go? You have the words of eternal life. Ann quoted that a number of times. So just a deep sense of
Surrender.
God's in charge.
Yeah.
Surrender.
Yeah. It is hard. I have gone through a dying of a friend who was 39 and had 4 children. And it is hard to make sense of why God would allow a loved one to be pulled from her cherished loved ones. But I guess that's something we'll have to maybe fully conclude later. Maybe not everything right now, but the gift of what she gave you is profound. And I just am so happy that she allowed you into her heart this way through her writing, and plus all of the other moments, and it's all there. It's still there.
And it's an odd thing, but she's maybe speaking to me more today than even during our life. I mean, for me to sit for 4 hours and read her thoughts uninterrupted without me saying anything, but just listening. And so I'm probably listening to her more, and it's really changing my life in that it's like I'm reading David's Psalms, so speaking to me these wonderful truths. But it's taking a lot of time.
Sure, yeah. I'm sure it's cherished time, though. Oh, I get my Ann time now, right? And you cultivate that space for her, and you get to hear from her heart.
And I have tears at least 4 or 5 times a week. And this is a person who I've found in her journal entry. So 15 years after we're married, a good friend dies. And she said, this is the first time I saw Howie with tears. And I thought about that. And I thought, yeah, there are times when there are tears, but not many. But now they're all the time. And sometimes 4 or 5 times in a day. And wailing, which I'd never experienced. But that's a frequent occurrence just when I just have a deep sense of missing her. And so it's a very tender time.
Yeah. But that tells us your deep love for her. So thank you for sharing. I know this is not an easy topic, especially so soon after her death, which was just a little more than a year ago. So you're still very fresh, but I know people will be blessed. So in closing, there's a couple questions I have left. And I've kind of asked this, I guess, but if she could say one thing, what would it be? Like just a line or something, like to tell people, like what would she want people to know? Just people in general. Is there kind of one thing that she would say to draw people to Christ or life?
Giving your heart to Christ is so worth it.
To have that hope, right? To have that hope that you can let go and that you can fall into the arms of Christ, and knowing that and believing in it. And that's faith. Like there's no assurances at that point. You have to, it's all belief. And,
forgiveness it's one of the rarest commodities in our present culture. And she was so distraught, especially by Christians who were angry and not loving enemies, not returning a blessing for an insult. What the Bible teaches. She was just so discouraged by professing Christians who were just angry.
Right. Yeah, we need to start with ourselves for sure. So if you could answer the question, this is like almost impossible, but who is Ann Dahl?
Luke 7 has a beautiful passage. This prostitute interrupts a dinner between a Pharisee and Jesus. And the Pharisee in his head is thinking, if Jesus knew who this woman was, he would not want to have anything to do with her. So Jesus says to the Pharisee, Simon, if somebody owes you X and somebody owes you 2X and you forgive them both, or 10X, whatever the number is, you forgive them both, which one will appreciate it more? And the Pharisee answers correctly, and Jesus says, he who's been forgiven much loves much. He who's been forgiven little loves little. I think she would say the people that are most self-righteous and furthest from Christ, more like a Pharisee, are those who don't see themselves as deeply flawed sinners. And to the extent that you see your sin, which is selfishness of any sort, to the extent you see that, to that extent you'll love. And she was concerned that most self-righteous people did not see themselves as deeply flawed sinners. So she saw herself as very distant from the perfection of Jesus, and that's why she loved much. He who has been forgiven much loves much. He who has been forgiven little loves little. And I think that would express why she loves so much.
That's beautiful. That's a wonderful way to end, Howard. So, I just want to thank you again. What a blessing it is for me to sit with you today. Again, I know it hasn't been easy, but while I cannot compare the loss I've felt in Ann's passing with your very great grief, please know that I too ache to see and be with Ann again. I do. And how grateful I am to have known her. I'm left with that. What a blessing it is to have crossed her beautiful path. I'm so grateful. So thank you for sharing her with us today. I hope everyone will be blessed by this conversation.
Thanks, Roxanne.
At Ann Dahl's funeral on January 28, 2023, a short video clip made by her friend, author Dee Breston, was shared. Let's listen now to that same clip revealing a little from Ann in her own words and voice.
I first heard the concept of idolatry from a Galatians Bible study and from a book by Tim Keller. He described idolatry as a sin underneath the sin, because I looked to someone or something else to meet my need for love, identity, meaning in life, something that they could never do. But if I get my needs met by the God who created me and made me for himself, then I'm free to love and to give to others without draining them dry. When my children were little, I loved them so much. My husband and I had gone through 3 years of infertility, and I just appreciated having children. One day in my quiet time, I read the challenge that I'm supposed to love God more than I love anyone else. And I realized that day that, to be honest, I love my children more than I loved my God. And then it hit me. If I loved God first and foremost, then I would actually have more love with which to love them than I would have if I loved them most.
Who was Ann Dahl? She was someone who once asked herself many years ago, how do I want to be when I die? Her answer, I want to be brave. Dear Ann, you were brave, and so much more. Until we meet again, sweet friend. Well, I'll return in a couple weeks with episode 8, circling back to a subject mentioned briefly in this interview. Who was G.K. Chesterton? To offer a suitable answer, I've enlisted local Chesterton enthusiast Mike Hagstrom, who will offer a proper introduction to Gilbert Keith Chesterton, a delightful English character who once, when instructed by a friend to enter a vehicle by turning sideways, responded, "I have no sideways." Until then, don't lose sight of the light.